There you go. Good evening. Welcome to the Dole Institute of Politics. I'm Bill Lacey, the director. I want to thank all of you for joining us for tonight's program on President Eisenhower. Let me tell you about a couple of quick programs coming up so that you can take advantage of them this summer. First of all, in fact, 2 weeks from tomorrow night, here at 7 p.m., we will present our third in our annual series that we started 2 years ago of presidential interpreters. Fritz Klein will interpret President Lincoln. As most of you probably know, we did a series on our presidential lecture series on President Lincoln in the spring, and we thought it would be appropriate this summer to bring a Lincoln interpreter. So that should be very interesting. We filled the house both times that we've done this previously, so we'd encourage you to be here early for good seats. Also, this has not been announced yet, but old friend of the Dole Institute, Stephen Jakes, who is fresh off the Obama campaign, has consented to lead a 3-week special summer study group that will be starting on the 14th of July. Those will be in the afternoon here in the Simons Media Room at 2:30 p.m. And we'll be sending out more information on the different subjects, but Stephen is already lining up some excellent guests, and it'll be a great opportunity for you to take the time here during the summer to come by in the afternoon and enjoy some of the regular programming that we do during the year here at the Dole Institute. I would tell you that David Nichols will be doing a book signing immediately after tonight's program. I'm sure all of you saw in the lobby that the KU Bookstores here is selling copies of his book, and would encourage all of you to pick up a copy. I would ask everyone with a cell phone to please turn your cell phone off. Make sure it's off right now. Inevitably, somebody's goes off during the program, and we usually don't shoot people whose cell phones go off during the program, but you usually are embarrassed. So if you could turn off your cell phones right now. And then finally, once our interview session is completed tonight, we will be doing Q&A from the audience. And the way we do Q&A is we'll have a student who will have a cordless mic. If you have a question, please raise your hand and wait for the student to come by and give you the mic so that we can get your question on our digital recording of the event, which will be up on our website in a couple days. And then we ask everyone, please do ask a question. A lot of people want to make statements. A lot of people want to have discussions, but we ask so that everyone has a chance to ask a question as much as possible. Please do ask a question and make it to the point. David Nichols is former Vice President for Academic Affairs at Southwestern College in Winfield, Kansas, where he still lives. His PhD is from the College of William and Mary, and his first book, Lincoln and the Indian Civil War Policy and Politics, was published by the University of Missouri Press in '78 and reissued as a paperback book by the University of Illinois Press in 2000. Dr. Nichols' book on President Eisenhower and civil rights, entitled A Matter of Justice, Eisenhower and the Beginning of the Civil Rights Revolution, was launched in September 2007 with events at the Eisenhower Library in Abilene and the Clinton Library in Little Rock, Arkansas, the latter in observance of the 50th anniversary of President Eisenhower's deployment of troops in Little Rock to support high school desegregation. We're delighted that Dr. Nichols could join us tonight, so please welcome him to the Dole Institute of Politics. David, we appreciate you taking the time to visit with us tonight. Let me start with a general question. Has history given a fair hearing to President Eisenhower on civil rights, and how do you deal with that issue in your book?
They certainly haven't, and I frankly think it's a disgrace to the profession that it's taken this long to have a book that really turns around the misimpressions that are out there about Dwight Eisenhower and black civil rights in the 50s. There are a lot of reasons for that. We can talk about them later, but I'll just say to you plainly, as I know how, that Dwight Eisenhower was more progressive on civil rights in the 1950s, not the 60s. That's where we get some of the confusion. In the 50s, than Lyndon Johnson, Harry Truman, John F. Kennedy, or Adlai Stevenson. I think that case can be absolutely demonstrated by what he did The problem with Eisenhower is you have to look at what he did, not just what he said. And we now have a new president who loves the bully pulpit, and Ike didn't, and that's a whole subject in itself. But I think we have not done it, and there's some bias and prejudice in the historians community that I think needs to be dealt with. I was shocked to find when I began to work on this what had not been done in over 5 decades with what's pretty obvious information in some cases, some of it very important public information. Let me just give you one pet example. Harry Truman issues the executive order to desegregate the armed forces in 1948. The truth is, while Truman deserves credit for that, he did not enforce that executive order well. 4 years later, most of the combat units were still segregated. Nearly all of the desegregation of the armed forces was done by Dwight Eisenhower, not Harry Truman. And if you have a textbook that tells me that, please be my guest. That's absolutely can be documented. He desegregated bases in the South. There wasn't a single combat unit left that was segregated in the armed forces by October of 1954. That's just one of my pet examples for how that's been a distorted image of Dwight Eisenhower.
How did President Eisenhower's experiences and service in the military affect his attitudes towards race and civil rights?
Well, he worked under the supervision of a War Department for which segregation was policy. And Eisenhower was not a rabble-rouser, and he did not campaign against that in an open fashion, though he did attempt to integrate, particularly 1942 and again 1944, attempted to integrate black units, not individuals, but black units, and to let black soldiers who wanted to be on the front lines, because most blacks were limited to supply work, to logistics. They were not allowed to do combat, and Eisenhower attempted to do that. He got batted down once by the War Department for getting too far ahead of the parade on that. That is, I think there's still a book I didn't do in great depth on his work in the military, except his background, but I know he attempted to make some changes and be more progressive, and it was not accepted by the government at that time. But I think there's a book still to be written, so if we have some aspiring historians out there, that one needs to be done in greater depth.
We were talking earlier about some of the importance of archives and the importance of sources that are available in archives that aren't available through a lot of more public sources. And apparently during the campaign, you found in some of your research that during his presidential campaign, Eisenhower stated privately that his first order of business would be to eliminate discrimination against black citizens in every area under the jurisdiction of the federal government. What immediate steps did he take after he was after his election on that?
The armed forces was part of it. And so he took dramatic steps to desegregate the armed forces, but the District of Columbia too. And it's hard for us in 2009 to say desegregating Washington, D.C. was a big deal. But in 1953, it was. And I would point out to you, his predecessor hadn't done it. Now, there was a Supreme Court decision that was important in that, in which the case was carried to the Supreme Court with Ike's approval by his Attorney General, great Attorney General Herbert Brownell. But by the end of 1953, well, let me say it this way. A black person in January of 1953, when Eisenhower came to office, couldn't get a drink of water, couldn't buy a meal in a restaurant, couldn't find a restroom, couldn't attend a movie in downtown Washington, D.C. By the end of 1953, that was all gone. Eisenhower even called in, this is typical Ike, no press releases, no photo ops, but he called in the movie moguls, the top names from Hollywood, to get them to pressure their local movie theaters to desegregate them. And so the District of Columbia, there were still residual problems for a long time. But Washington was never again a segregated city. But when he took office in 1953, it was as segregated as any city in the South. It was really a southern city in that regard. And so he started immediately. And to him, he made the pledge during the campaign. And as I recall, on October 8th, 1952, he said he would eliminate every last vestige of segregation in the District of Columbia. And he acted to do that. And that was, it's the nation's capital. This was very important in the 50s. We look backward and say, well, that seems pretty small. One of the things you have to realize is the federal government had next to no authority to enforce this kind of thing in the states. They didn't have financial levers in the states. They didn't have all kinds of authority that we now take for granted in enforcing equal rights in the states. But what Eisenhower said we could do, and his great criticism of his predecessors was they didn't use the authority they had. So the armed forces and Washington, D.C. And one other thing I'd add about that is Eisenhower didn't have to do this. Politically, he did not always election to blacks. He could have been elected president if he didn't get a single black vote. And you may know that historically, ever since the Great Depression, blacks have voted heavily for the Democratic Party. And even in those days, it was about 65 to 70% for the Democratic Party. Politically, he didn't have to do it. He did it, and the title of the book says that comes from an Eisenhower quotation. He did it as a matter of justice.
You make a very compelling case in the book that President Eisenhower's judicial appointments, not just the Supreme Court, but really at all the federal appointments that he made, really emphasized his commitment to civil rights. Can you speak at some length about that? Because I know you feel very strongly about that.
Yeah, I think it's his great contribution in civil rights because it was enduring. It went beyond his presidency. At dinner we were talking about Frank Johnson, for instance, who the great civil rights federal judge in Alabama, an Eisenhower appointee. He was on the bench for 44 years. And he's the one who cleared the way for Martin Luther King and his entourage to march from Selma, Alabama to Montgomery in 1965. And he refused to appoint segregationist judges. Consistently refused to. There's one that got past him because he was misrepresented, a man named Ben Cameron. But he took a great personal interest, and until he had his heart attack in 1955, he would personally interview all the federal court appointees. Now, his great right-hand person in all this was Herbert Brownell, who was, I think, one of the great attorney generals in the history of the United States. Hasn't gotten his due. Somebody needs to do a biography of Herbert Brownell. But it was a great man, and probably more liberal than Eisenhower even on civil rights, but Eisenhower trusted him. He actually asked Brownell to be his chief of staff, and Brownell turned him down and said he wanted to stay with the law, so he became attorney general. But he appointed 5 men to the Supreme Court, all of them progressive on civil rights, Earl Warren being the first, John Marshall Harlan being the second, William Brennan, one of the most liberal members of the court ever, being the third. We can come back to those in terms of the Brown decision, perhaps, but he took a great interest in judicial appointments, refused to appoint segregationists. I have a son named for John F. Kennedy, and this was a hard thing for me to figure out because I'd always thought so much of Kennedy. Kennedy started appointing segregationists right and left when he took office. Kennedy didn't get religion on the subject until 1963. Then he did some wonderful stuff, he and Lyndon Johnson. That resulted in the Civil Rights Acts of 64 and 63. And in his first 2.5 years in office, Kennedy appointed segregationists to federal courts. And one of the reasons you ended up with a movement in the streets in those early 60s was because the blacks in the South realized they could no longer go to the courts for help. And they could during the Eisenhower administration. And so eventually that changed, and for the good. But Eisenhower just doesn't get the credit that he should have gotten for that. He was very consistent about this. And he wrote his brother Edgar. I have this paper up here because I've got some quotes. He wrote his brother Edgar in 1956, quote, "The lawyers of this country have not come to understand that I do not consider federal judgeships as included in the list of appointments subject to patronage." That is to say, he didn't think they ought to be political appointments. They ought to be appointed on quality. And when they tried to add 25 federal judgeships in 1959 because due to the civil rights cases, the courts had gotten overloaded, they tried to add, and William Rogers, the Attorney General at that time, wanted to add 25 judgeships. But then Lyndon Johnson and Richard Russell and the Southerners in the Senate in particular said, well, we want something out of that. We want some people for us. We want some. Eisenhower said, okay, we'll split them between Republicans and Democrats, half and half. But they must be qualified in the way Eisenhower meant. And what he meant was no segregationists, no open segregationists. And when they got that word from Eisenhower, Johnson and Russell quit and refused to support the bill. But Eisenhower was steadfast on that. He would not do it.
Brown versus Topeka Board of Education, that decision came down during the president's first term. What was his reaction to it?
Well, his specific reaction, and this is where the controversy comes about Eisenhower, and it has to do, I'll talk later about this man, Earl Warren, because he had a lot to do with it. But for the moment, that was the Brown decision. You know about the Brown decision. I shouldn't assume every audience does, okay? In 1954, May 17th, 1954, the Supreme Court ruled that separate facilities, this was actually not about education, but it was about transportation, but it still got generalized. Separate facilities were inherently unequal. It's transportation in Plessy v. Ferguson, forgive me, I misspoke. Anyway, that separate educational facilities were inherently unequal, and therefore ordered the desegregation of the schools. So that was the transportation one I was referring to. My mouth leaps ahead of my brain sometimes. What they reversed was Plessy v. Ferguson in 1896, which had been the Supreme Court decision that enshrined segregation, and it dealt with transportation, railway transportation, and said segregation was legal. Brown turned that over, May 17th. 2 days later, Dwight Eisenhower said to the press this, if I find it. Quote, "The Supreme Court has spoken, and I am sworn to uphold the constitutional processes in this country, and I will obey." End of quote. Now, that's been a lot of the controversy. Doesn't sound like a ringing endorsement, doesn't it? Doesn't sound like, boy, this is a great moral victory, right? Okay, you've got to think this through, and people have jumped on him ever since to say he never really endorsed the Brown decision. Now, I ask you, this is a soldier. So when he says, "This is my duty," you can almost hear him click the heels and salute. And furthermore, he followed through on and did it, and I'll talk about that in a moment. But I would also point out to you, if anybody, I've challenged audiences all across the country for this, if any of you can give me one quotation from Harry Truman, Lyndon Johnson, John F. Kennedy, or Adlai Stevenson in the months after the Brown decision about anything about it, please be my guest. The Southerners had a lot to say. Kennedy eventually said something a couple of years later and then backed off it. But you know, you have to get in the context of the 1950s. So often I preach to folks that this was not the 60s. Things changed in the 60s. But this was the 50s. And segregation was still so enshrined, congressmen and senators could use the N-word anytime they wished in public. They could talk segregation all they liked. This was a totally different environment. So Eisenhower makes this very soldierly statement of duty. I wish he had said more. I really do. But he did not believe, and the reason he didn't say anything more was that he thought it was improper for a president to comment on the Supreme Court decision. He thought the president's job was to enforce it. And he used to argue with people and say, well, what if I didn't agree with it? Would you want me to say that? So that was his point of view. You can like it or dislike it, but that's what he thought. He also thought that moderate white Southerners would not be persuaded by a sermon on the evils of segregation, but they might be persuaded by an appeal to obey the law. But let me say to you then what else he did, because with Ike you have to look at what he did, not just what he said. The day after the Brown decision, this is May 8th, 1954, he called in the commissioners of the District of Columbia and told them to make the nation's capital a model for the country in school desegregation. And they had a plan within a week. Do things happen in Lawrence that fast? Had a plan within a week. Now, it wasn't a perfect plan. It was a gradual plan, but they had one. And he did all that, and he also, what people don't realize is Eisenhower had already desegregated the schools for military dependents, the ones controlled by the federal government, about 63 of them in the South. He had already desegregated those before the Brown decision. He had desegregated 43 of the 62, and the others were desegregated in part because they were shared authority. He had done that before, and he above all appointed judges that would help hold Brown. And you all know about him sending troops into Little Rock, Arkansas in 1957, do you? That's the dramatic thing. All right, he sent those troops in 1957 to enforce a federal court order for school desegregation. That federal court order was issued by Ronald Davies, an Eisenhower judicial appointee. And so all those things, you look at what he did, not just what he said. He supported Brown, but if you want nothing else, look at his next judicial appointment. This is really fun. His second appointment to the Supreme Court was a man named John Marshall Harlan II. Now, this is complex. I hope I don't lose you. If people start snoring, I'll be in trouble. But anyway, John Marshall Harlan II. This was after the first appointment to the Supreme Court after the Brown decision. With me? Brown decision's May 1954. Harlan gets nominated to the Supreme Court in late 1955. The Senate fights him all the way on it. He resubmits it in January of he nominates him at the end of 54, and he renominates him in early 55. Sorry, I got those dates transposed. Anyway, John Marshall Harlan II was the grandson and the namesake. You remember I mentioned Plessy v. Ferguson, 1896? Okay. He was the grandson in the same namesake of the lone dissenting vote on the Supreme Court in 1896. John Marshall Harlan, the original one, was the one who voted against the segregation decision in 1896. Eisenhower's first appointment after Brown is his grandson. Do you think the segregationists of the South didn't know what that meant? This is vintage Eisenhower. He didn't make a speech, didn't make a moral sermon of some kind. Then, if you still don't believe it, look at his next appointment. Just before the election in 1956, he appoints William Brennan of New Jersey, who turned out to be one of the most liberal, almost too liberal for Ike, some respects, particularly when it got to criminal law later. But you have to look at what Eisenhower did. So desegregating the D.C. schools, appointing these kind of judges, I think he supported Brown. And he said he did, and I won't take your time now, but I could cite you private, personal, confidential letters he wrote to friends in which he supported Brown. And so why people say he didn't support it is just crazy to me. Yes.
You noticed, David, or you noted, you've got Earl Warren's book here, and you talked a little bit. There was some tension there, and I think your book makes the case that a lot of the kind of current view or the current history or the traditional history on Eisenhower and civil rights came from what Earl Warren said.
That's right. That's right.
And what's wrong with that?
Yeah, I don't know. You have to slow me down if I get too deep into this.
No.
Anyway. Yeah. You will hear it. We have a new Supreme Court judicial appointee coming up for hearings soon. And I swear to you, you will hear some news person on television say, well, Dwight Eisenhower thought that appointing Earl Warren to the Supreme Court was the worst damn fool mistake he ever made. That's a myth. But it's like all myths, it's half true. There was a rift between these men, but not because of the Brown decision. That's what you have to understand. Eisenhower had some discomfort with some of the criminal law decisions, including Miranda later. Ike, in some respects, was not a great civil libertarian when it came to criminal law. But that aside, it was not with Brown. But then the problem is this book. This book. I bought this for 85 cents on Amazon, so you can get one too. This is the Memoirs of Earl Warren, published posthumously. And posthumous books, you always have to be careful because maybe the person didn't intend everything to be in it that ends up being in it. But Earl Warren, in this book, simply trashes Dwight Eisenhower on civil rights, the man who had appointed him. And it's a myth that the news people will tell you, again, Eisenhower didn't know what he was getting with Warren. That's totally false. It can be proven as false. He knew him well. Furthermore, his Attorney General, I mentioned before, Herbert Brownell, went to ball games with Warren. Warren had been the vice presidential candidate with Tom Dewey in 1948, and Brownell had run that campaign for them. He'd been their campaign manager. Eisenhower knew Warren well. And this is a story I have to tell, Bill. What happens is, November of 1952, election's over, Eisenhower won, and he walks into Herbert Brownell's hotel room in New York City and says, I've been thinking about Earl Warren. And I think I want to call up Warren and tell him, while I won't have a place in the cabinet for him, that I want him to consider him for the first vacancy we have on the Supreme Court. Now, you have to think about this. This is November 1952. There was no vacancy on the Supreme Court. They did not know that the Supreme Court Chief Justice, the Chief Justice of the United States, was going to die the next September. Eisenhower, whatever he was not an impulsive man. He was a planner. And I can't prove what I'm about to say to you, but I believe he was already thinking about running for a second term. In the age of Roosevelt, you couldn't be a great president unless you ran for a second term. And Earl Warren had run for president 3 times. 44, 48, and 52. And so, not unlike what Barack Obama did with Hillary Clinton, Dwight Eisenhower appointed Earl Warren to the Supreme Court and pretty well guaranteed he wouldn't be a rival in 1956. I can't prove that. It's circumstantial. But it's circumstantial that's interesting. But Eisenhower also knew, and I have documents that show it, he and Herbert Brownell were discussing the Brown case that was already before the court, before they took office. And Eisenhower, and they knew what was happening with it. He knew he was appointing a Chief Justice who would be liberal on the subject of race, and he made it a recess appointment. He appoints him on September 30th, and he takes office the next Monday, the first Monday in October when the court normally starts, and he isn't approved by the Senate, isn't confirmed by the Senate until March. But Eisenhower put him in there immediately because he knew he could for the Brown decision, and the Brown decision was no shock to Eisenhower at all. So, what's the problem with Earl Warren? I think the problem with Earl Warren, by the way, I think is a great man. We're talking about real human beings here, and I better wet the throat a little bit here. A great man in many respects, a great Chief Justice, so some people from other political persuasions might not like him. But I think he never forgave this war hero for coming home and cheating him out of the presidency. And having said that, Eisenhower may have had some political calculation in appointing him to the Supreme Court. So this book comes out, and Ike gets no credit for anything. And I don't know, is this time for the Stag Dinner story, or should we save that?
No, you go ahead and say whatever you want to say.
Well, okay. You said you had 10 questions on that list.
Oh, that's okay. You go ahead.
But I don't know what they are. Earl Warren tells this story, and it's awful. I apologize for sharing it with you, but it's the linchpin of the anti-Eisenhower outlook. People in my profession, in the historian's profession, have assumed that if the Chief Justice said it, it must be true. And what the Chief Justice did in this book is say, in effect, Dwight Eisenhower was a racist. And this story is the one. And almost every scholar's book you pick up will repeat this story, including some Pulitzer Prize winners I could name. This is the story. On February 8th, 1954, Eisenhower had a stag dinner at the White House. Now that tells you what a different era it was, doesn't it? President Obama will have no stag dinners, I guarantee you. Okay? You can't do that now, but they had a stag dinner. These were men getting together to talk politics. And Earl Warren was the guest of honor that night. Now this is February 8th, 54. When was the Brown decision, you remember? May, okay. All right. And they have dinner, and there are some of the Southerners there, including some of the ones that are involved with that case, again, a little bit different than we'd have. And so as they're going to the next room, Eisenhower is walking along, taking Warren by the elbow, and he says, as we filed out of the dining room to another room where coffee and an after-dinner drink was served, the president, of course, precedes. I'm reading from Warren now. And on this occasion, he took me by the arm, and as we walked along, speaking of the southern states and the segregation cases, he said, quote, "These are not bad people. All they are concerned about is to see that their sweet little girls are not required to sit in school alongside some big overgrown Negroes." Now, it's an awful story. It's awful. And it's the worst kind of racist stereotype you can think of. I don't know how to explain it. I have to tell you, Earl Warren is the only source for that story. That doesn't mean it didn't happen. White men said a lot of stuff like that in the 50s. So if you take the worst case scenario that Eisenhower actually meant it that way, although he could have been parroting back, Jimmy Burns, the governor of South Carolina, had said something very similar to him back in July. He could have been saying this is the way they look at it. I don't know. But I think this story, most historians even, have looked at that story and said, if Earl Warren says that, it must be true. And if Eisenhower said what Earl Warren said, Eisenhower must be a racist. Therefore, we can ignore absolutely everything else he did. We can ignore desegregating the District of Columbia. We can ignore desegregating the armed forces. We can ignore, even Earl Warren ignored the appointments to his own bench. We can ignore all those judicial appointments. We can ignore him proposing and getting past the first civil rights legislation in 82 years. We can ignore him sending troops into Little Rock, Arkansas because of that story. And I think that's the fault of the historian's profession. It's not, you can grant the story, and Eisenhower was not a saint, and I don't think he understood very well what it felt like to be like in black in America. And there are a couple of other episodes where he tells darky stories. And so he was not pure on this. But my quarrel with my profession is this was not enough. It doesn't excuse us not looking at what else he did.
How did President Eisenhower interact with civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King?
Not much until 1958. In 1958, June 23rd, 1958, he held kind of a historic meeting for that time. Again, this seems strange to us, but for black leaders to come and have a policy discussion in the White House was something that just hadn't happened. And so Martin Luther King was one of four. Roy Wilkins of the NAACP was there. A. Philip Randolph, trying to remember the fourth one now, from the Urban League. Anyway, four leaders came and worked with him. Martin Luther King corresponded with him quite a bit. Didn't always support him, always wanted him to be more outspoken, because King was so magnificently outspoken about things. And Eisenhower, he would have liked Eisenhower to use the bully pulpit more, wanted him to come to the South and make speeches about segregation. But Eisenhower didn't do that. So he had a pretty arm's length relationship with those folks, I would say. They had a good meeting in that, but Eisenhower thought he had done so much. And these leaders told him in that meeting in June of 1958 that it hadn't been enough. And he was a little perplexed by that. He thought he'd done a lot. So he didn't have a close, intimate relationship with those folks. When he sent the troops into Little Rock, though, he King supported him very, very strongly, supported him publicly. And so Richard Nixon actually was Eisenhower's delegate to meet with King personally quite a bit.
Interesting. Talk a little, I have a couple more questions, then we're going to open it up to your questions. But talk a little bit about the whole situation with Little Rock, the situation, the president's action, and the reaction to the action that he took.
Well, Little Rock is fascinating, and I shared with the people over dinner that's part of how I got on this merry-go-round. I was intrigued by this president who had been painted as not being involved in civil rights. I mean, Stephen Ambrose, wonderful biographer of Eisenhower, said Ike was, quote, no leader at all in civil rights. And so I'd heard all that, but Little Rock didn't fit. Now, you got to stop and think about that. What if the president of the United States today, what if Mr. Obama sent troops to Lawrence, Kansas, because we found there was some sort of terrorist plot connected with KU or something? You know, they were patrolling the streets of Lawrence, Kansas. Can you imagine how controversial that would be? Soldiers with fixed bayonets? Dwight Eisenhower sent troops into a former Confederate state for the first time since Reconstruction after the Civil War. An extraordinary decision. And everybody now who talks about it said, well, he had to do it, didn't he? Of course he didn't have to do it. He was politically popular. He didn't have to do it. If you understand, there was a riot. It was a riot. It's a ghastly riot. These 9 black students attempted to integrate Central High School in Little Rock. And people not only hurled expletives at them, but threw rocks at them and attacked them physically. And it was an awful scene. But if keeping order was the issue, Governor Orville Faubus and his National Guard would have kept the peace. The issue was desegregating the school. And as I said to you before, Ronald Davies, an Eisenhower appointee, had issued a federal court order. And Eisenhower believed that federal court orders ought to be enforced. And he did. Now, there's all kinds of things connected with this. It was a Democratic governor, not a Republican governor. And there's politics involved with it, but he did so. And afterwards, the Democratic Advisory Council, which included Adlai Stevenson and Harry Truman, accused him of indecisiveness in this matter. But in fact, Faubus called out the National Guard the evening of September 2nd, 1957. On September 4th, 1957, Herbert Brownell, remember this great man, issued a statement to the press that he said explicitly with the president's approval that Mr. Faubus should be warned that a number of steps could be taken to prosecute him for doing this, including the president sending troops or federalizing the National Guard. That was September 4th. Eventually, Eisenhower met with Faubus at his vacation place in Providence, Rhode Island, in Newport, Rhode Island, to be precise. And Eisenhower again warned him. Eisenhower had warned him in writing. He said, "I am sworn to uphold the Constitution," that's the word again, "and that I will do so with every legal means at my command." Now, what you couldn't know, and even Faubus didn't know, is that Eisenhower and Brownell had planned for this moment from the time Brown was passed. They hoped that we wouldn't have to do it, but the one thing they'd figured out legally they could do is send troops out, strangely enough. And they used the precedents of Washington putting down the Whiskey Rebellion and some others. They left the Civil War out for obvious reasons, even though it was probably the most extraordinary precedent. They had the 101st Airborne Division that he eventually used had been trained for riot control. Now, where do you think those riots were going to be? In Europe? No, they trained for them. They'd understood that they might have to send troops in. One reason Eisenhower supported civil rights legislation in 1957 is he desperately wanted some alternatives to that kind of sledgehammer approach to taking care of things. So he sent the troops in, did it very well. Nobody was killed. The school was integrated. That's the good news. The bad news was that then Faubus closed the high schools the next year, and there was nothing legally the government could do about it, so it didn't come out that well. Eisenhower threatened to send troops in again in 1958, And there was another very important Supreme Court decision about Little Rock, which he fully supported, and supported in much more dramatic words than he did the Brown decision in 1954. One of the problems with Eisenhower is my historian friends pinning down to the statement he made in May 19th, 1954, and this Stag Dinner story, and they say if that's all we need to know about Eisenhower, we don't need to know anything more, so they don't look at what he did in 1957 or 1958. But he made a very dramatic intervention, and Herman Talmadge, who's the senator from Georgia, commented and said, "I was a general. Politician might have backed down, but he said when he sent the troops in, we knew he meant business." So it was very important, I think.
Take just a moment, David, before we open up to audience Q&A to express what you think Eisenhower's legacy on civil rights is.
Well, I think the legacy primarily is that he and Herbert Brownell together laid the legal foundation for further progress in the 60s. And that foundation was partly the judicial appointments, but also the Civil Rights Act of 1957 actually was a very strong piece of legislation that he and Brownell proposed. Lyndon Johnson and his Southern allies gutted it from almost all the things that ended up being a pretty cosmetic bill. But the original bill was a strong one. And then they passed a Voting Rights Bill again in 1960. So in both legislation and judicial appointments, a fresh legal foundation had been laid for the kind of legislation that we eventually got in 1964 and 65. And so I think that's their major contribution. Little Rock is a dramatic episode in that, but the most important things were those more quiet achievements. The bill that they proposed in 1957, the part that made such great controversy, Part 3 of it, would have empowered the Attorney General to go into federal court and sue to protect any constitutional right, including school desegregation. And the Southerners, who really controlled the Senate and much of the House at that point, rose up in arms and threatened to completely kill the bill. In fact, Lyndon Johnson went to Eisenhower and said, "There's going to be no bill at all if you keep that in it." And Eisenhower debated for a long time about just doing that, and finally agreed. He thought it was important because this was the first civil rights legislation in 82 years. Harry Truman made proposals, but he was never able to get them through. Dwight Eisenhower did, and with a Democratic Congress. It was not a small achievement. He was a much better legislative president than he's ever been given credit for. So,
okay. We're going to open it up to your questions and answers. If you have a question, if you would please raise your hand, and either Chelsea or Peter will come by and you'll get a chance to ask it.
Oh, okay.
David, I had a chance to pick up your book when you were here at the River City Reading Festival. I think on page 241, you report some correspondence with the editor of the Atlanta Constitution, McGill. I think that that, to me, was the highlight of your research, where you basically talked about Eisenhower's exercise of influence. Could you fill in a little bit more of the background on that correspondence, if you feel it's relevant?
Well, that particular letter, you probably have it fresher in your mind than I do, but I do remember the correspondence, and he carried on quite a correspondence with McGill, who was a very liberal newspaper man of the Atlanta Constitution, and it does talk, as I recall, about how they could make progress in the South. But I'm sorry, my memory's a little fuzzy on that particular one now a little bit. But I do remember it well. That did you have a particular phrase in it that you thought was particularly good? In other words, can you bail out my bad memory?
No, it's probably not fair. Guess I got to find the right spot here now.
I always hate to misquote. That's part of why I'm asking you that.
Yeah, basically, I'll read the part that you have footnoted because it went by me a little bit the first time. It said Eisenhower shared two convictions with McGill. The first of these is that until America had achieved reality in the concept of individual dignity and equality before the law, we will not have become completely worthy of our limitless opportunities. The second thing is that I believe that coercive law is by itself powerless to bring about complete compliance on its own terms when in any extensive region the great mass of public opinion is in bitter opposition. But Eisenhower's thinking transcended his usual platitude about the limits of law. The second fact, he continued, does not excuse us from using every kind of legitimate influence to bring about the Enlightenment through education, persuasion, leadership, and indeed example. Of course, we cannot overlook the need for law where law is clearly necessary and useful. So again, influence beyond the scope of statute.
Yeah. Well, thank you for scrubbing up my memory on that. One reason my memory will go a little bit is I'm working on another book that's very different. But you've touched on something that is an issue with Eisenhower. I think those were very sincere words. He would do these little homilies about, you can't change matters of the heart with law, even at the same time when he's proposing legislation. He would do that again and again. It's one of the things I'm a little critical of him was he didn't realize what that did to black feelings. That sometimes he didn't understand what they needed from him rhetorically to have some kind of hope. And so he didn't understand that black folks had been so oppressed for so long that they got to where they hung on every word of the president for some degree of hope. Sometimes Democratic politicians had demagogued that pretty badly. But he would say this thing that law alone won't do it. And yet people like Martin Luther King would argue, but the law can possibly keep somebody from killing me. And so I think that was one of the things. I think he was right. It does take a change of attitude. But as we've seen with the civil rights legislation of 64 and 65 particularly, when the law got passed, then the law helped change attitudes too. And I'm not sure that Ike had a deep feeling for that. But on the other hand, he believed so much in equality. People miss. Remember about the sit-ins in early 1960, particularly in North Carolina? We had them earlier in Wichita. Wichita didn't get as much press. But didn't you have some up here too? And folks were telling me about Tennessee. Well, anyway, the sit-ins in North Carolina, and Eisenhower was asked about it, and he said, I have the quotation, but I won't bother to pull it out. He said he absolutely supported the right of anybody to exercise their constitutional rights in that fashion. And Harry Truman said if they came into his store, he'd throw them out. But Eisenhower, very consistent, and I think what you read really reflects that view that you needed to grow this understanding. And I think he did. I think he helped grow it. He worked with Billy Graham closely. Billy Graham desegregated his crusades early in the South. He corresponded with Billy Graham and played with Billy Graham to try to have some influence in the South to help change things too. And McGill's another. He carried on quite a correspondence with another number of these moderate Southern leaders.
You have a question over here? Right here.
Have you worked with the Eisenhower Museum in Abilene to try to educate the hundreds and thousands of people that go through there on this issue of civil rights? I was there a couple years ago, but nothing sticks out as a big display that I would think would be a wonderful opportunity.
What they have is pretty good. The Eisenhower Library has done so much for me so generously that I've never felt like I dared harass them too much about that. I've thought about it, and I agree with you. I think, of course, when you go through that museum, the scope of this man's career is just incredible. And when you look at his foreign affairs service, his war service, and all that, how much do you give to civil rights? Because I don't even pretend it's the most important thing he did. I just want him to get justice for what he did. But I've kind of thought one of these days I would talk with the new director over there about that and see if we couldn't get a little more. But there's nothing inaccurate in the display they have. It's just not very big. You're right.
Chelsea, we had a question right over this way.
I wanted to ask if he had any particular response to the Southern Manifesto.
Yeah, he didn't comment on it very much publicly. He commented that a typical Eisenhower public statement. You know, this is the thing. Eisenhower never criticized anybody in public. This was part of his rather contrived personal persona. And he said, well, they said they would pursue only legal means, and so he got back to this very legalistic kind of thing. He was not highly critical of it. That was in March of '56, I believe. At the same time, in March of '56, and you can read it in my book, he was conducting cabinet meetings looking at strong civil rights legislation. And so his response to the Southern Manifesto. The Southern Manifesto was signed by about 110 congressmen, senators, and representatives declaring for segregation. It was a very strong statement. And his response was to work with promoting civil rights legislation. And so April 10th, 1956, the Attorney General took the proposals for that legislation to the House Judiciary Committee. Now, it was an election year. They knew they wouldn't get it passed then. But then they brought that legislation back up in January of '57. This was Eisenhower's way of dealing with that. He would not take on those folks head on. And I'm not always comfortable with the fact he wouldn't, but he did not. Is anything more connected with your question you'd like to ask?
I asked the question based on the fact that he had this legislation passing through, and I know that the manifesto was a direct attempt to, with any legal means, to overturn Brown v. Board, suggesting the Supreme Court had overstepped their bounds. And so I was just curious in what public position he had taken.
No, not much. Not much. And that's Eisenhower. And that's the thing about him. He did not use the bully pulpit. Just not at all. His thing would be to make another judicial appointment. So in late '56, he appoints William Brennan, which was not something the folks who signed that thing wanted. You know, I mean, he didn't appoint any Southerners to the Supreme Court, in fact, and he was planning this legislation, and he went about appointing people in other ways, but he did not use the bully pulpit, and that's the great critique. And my particular critique is he didn't understand that African American people needed to hear that. And I think that is a legitimate criticism of him, but that's just not who he was. And I don't pretend he was a saint. He was not. I just think we need to look holistically at everything he did and have it balanced and for heaven's sakes not make people who became before or after him who did worse into saints. But no, I give Harry Truman lots of credit for issuing that executive order in 1948, and I think once John Kennedy got pushed by the movement in the South to do it, he did the right thing in mid-'63, and Lyndon Johnson did magnificently in '64. But Lyndon Johnson was sure not his friend on all of this, although Johnson did not sign the Southern Manifesto.
Is there a question over here? Right here, Peter. This gentleman's had his hand up a few minutes.
Do you remember the Saturday Evening Post cover concerning the Little Rock desegregation by Norman Rockwell? It showed a high school girl in a pink dress marching into Little Rock High surrounded by National Guard troops. Do you remember that cover?
I may have seen it since. I don't really remember it, no, but it was one of the famous Rockwell paintings, wasn't it? Yeah. Well, it was a very dramatic story, and my book, I should tell you about my book. My book is following Eisenhower around, looking over his shoulder. He does not do justice to those 9 students, not at all. It's a white man's history, and those students suffered so much, and just getting them in the door of the school was only part of it. They were persecuted in all kinds of ways, in the months that came. And the stories of all those students and what happened to them in later years, I've interviewed a couple of them, and they went through an awful lot. And they weren't all happy with Eisenhower, even though he sent the troops in. Eisenhower, again, didn't reach out to them personally, which I think he maybe could have. Although Grace, help me. The memoir. It'll come to me in a minute. I tell people that I'm old enough, the part of my brain that has names in it has died. But anyway, there is one memoir by one of those students, a marvelous memoir that you might want to read. Warriors Don't Cry. Yeah. About the knock on the door. They had the riot, and they sent the children home, and they're at home that night in their house, and they hear a knock on the door, and the grandmother grabs the shotgun and says, "What's going on?" You know, they were all scared to death. This was one of the students who was trying to integrate the school. And she says, "Who's out there?" She said, "It's white men with black hats. What are they doing here? What are they doing here?" She said, "Gentlemen, state your business or I'll have to do mine." And they said, "We're federal marshals. We're from the office of the President of the United States, and we've come to tell you that your daughter can go to school tomorrow and she will be protected." That's when the troops came in. And it's a very dramatic story. But he didn't reach out to them in any more personal fashion. I sometimes wish he really had. I think he didn't understand in his gut what it felt like to be black in those days. But he was committed to equal opportunity and did things that he just hadn't gotten credit for. So it's a balanced view is all I plead for.
I just want to really quickly let the gentleman know the Norman Rockwell is the Ruby Bridges integration in New Orleans, Louisiana. It was not depicting Little Rock.
Okay.
And by the way, New Orleans, Eisenhower threatened to send troops into New Orleans. That's in my book. That was 1960. And he told the Attorney General for Civil Rights at that time if they couldn't handle it otherwise, he would. And he didn't because they were able to handle it with federal marshals. But, yes, ma'am.
How do you explain Eisenhower's antipathy towards segregation? Was it his participation and awareness of the Cold War, or were there personal factors in his life?
Well, yeah, finding out where Eisenhower's values come from is a bit of a mystery, and I don't pretend to have solved it very well. He picked up some good values from his mother. His father was pretty flaky in some ways, and he didn't get along well with his father. The Brethren church he was in had a lot of equalitarian values. He was influenced. One of the things I think we underestimate the education of our military people in this country. The folks who go through the academies generally turn out to be pretty enlightened people. It's fashionable to pick on our military leaders sometime, but if you want reasoned, educated outlook on things in American life, including foreign policy, you can't do much better than a Colin Powell or a Dwight Eisenhower. You know, the people who are well educated. So I think West Point did well for him. He spent time with General Fox Connor, a wonderful man in Panama. And they didn't have much to do down there, so he studied. Connor had a huge library. Eisenhower wrote later that it was like having a graduate course in the humanities and military science. He picked up a number of values. And then I think his heart was really moved by the black soldiers who wanted to fight for their country during World War II. And he tried to integrate those black units. And they slapped him down in the War Department. And he finally got to where he got them convinced that about 2,400 of them were allowed to volunteer. And I think that moved him deeply. But I must confess to you, there's still great mystery about where those values come from. I don't pretend to have solved that altogether. You know, for this guy to come out of Abilene and be what he was in so many ways, not just this, is extraordinary.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions if there are any more. Okay, David, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Really great.